So Miss Casey asked me to put together some thoughts for a short little video. As I was thinking through what I'd like to talk about, wasn't sure where to go with it, and then I just kind of realized, hey, it's what I've been reading lately. I always use my phone on my Bible on my phone, do my reading at night, and I like to read. I just typically start at Genesis, read through the Bible. Sometimes it takes several months, sometimes it takes a year. When I get to the end, I'll just start right back over and do it again. So the last few weeks I've been in the book of Exodus reading about Moses, and it's a pretty interesting story. And I feel like every time I read through the Bible, read through a different story, I find out something new, pick up on something about certain characters maybe I missed the first time around. And so quickly what I want to talk to you about, the point is finding God's will in your life and not feeling like you've messed up to a point where God can no longer use you. So arguably there's very few characters in the Bible that are more recognizable today than the name of Moses. If you say that name, most people are going to say, oh yeah, he's in the Bible, had something to do with that. You know, you got like Moses, Jesus, Adam and Eve. People know those names. It doesn't matter if they know anything about their Bible. And Moses was a very instrumental person in the Old Testament. Won't really go into a lot of detail. You can always read it yourself. But it's suffices to say he was a very important character and God used him mightily. But there's two main takeaways I want to discuss about Moses. The first one is that, and I think it applies to us today and it should be relevant to everybody, is that it doesn't matter how big of a mess you've made with your life, that God can still use you. A lot of us feel like we've done things where our canvas is just too messed up that God can't make it into a work of art, but that's not the case. And we learned that from Moses. Many people are familiar with, many people are familiar with how his mom put him in a river as a baby. He was found by Pharaoh's daughter. But what a lot of people don't necessarily remember is that he was a murderer. He actually killed somebody in Egypt. He saw some Egyptians and some Hebrews going at it, and he was a meddler. He couldn't stay out of it. He wanted to jump in and help some people out. He goes over there and he actually murders a guy in cold blood with his bare hands. And then thought he was going to be slick, hid the body, nobody would ever know. As it would turn out, somebody identified him and they started talking, and so he decided he had to skip town. He took off to the desert and spent many years out there. So he was an actual murderer. And then not only that, he murdered, but then he's in hiding. You know, he left all his family, all his home behind because he figured he'd done made a mess of things. Never really identified himself as a big player in God's plan. So here he is out in the desert, done killed somebody, basically he's in hiding, starts a family, just living out in the desert in the caves and all secret because he done messed things up. But it was there where God found him. Or, well, God never lost him, but it was where God called him back again and began to fulfill his plan with the story of the burning bush. You know, most people know that too. So the first thing we learned from Moses is that it doesn't matter what we've done, that God can absolutely still use us, and he's prepared us and equipped us for whatever task he has for us. So failures are very much a part of making us who we are, and I don't think it's God's will that anybody would sin and fall short, but when we do, we have to understand that it's not it doesn't prevent us from ever being used. We have to take those scars and those battle wounds and we move forward and we become better. So that's the first thing that I've kind of learned from Moses. And then the second thing is this, is that even when you're doing God's plan in your life and you've found God's will, or you've prayed and you seek God's face and you know you're moving forward in the right direction, there's still going to be hiccups. There are still things that are going to come against you and you're going to face more failures. And so again, I want to go back to Moses on this. When God called him out in the desert, told him what the plan was, he said, you're going to go to Egypt, you're going to do these signs, these wonders, and you're going to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. So Moses heard the audible voice. So there was no gray area as to what was expected. Of course, he was obstinate. He's like, God, I can't do this. I can't do this. He kept on whining. And so finally God said, all right, well, I'll let your brother Aaron help you. But this is what I take away from this. So Moses knew exactly what he was supposed to do. That God's plan for him was as clear as it could possibly be. God had already performed signs for Moses privately to say, hey, this is proof and you're going to take this. So Moses knew the plan. God shared it, told him, they communicated about it. And even then, when he went to Pharaoh, it was failure after failure. And I try to put myself in Moses' situation, thinking, God, you told me you were going to harden his heart. You told me this was the plan, but man, one thing after another is going wrong. He goes to Pharaoh. He's like, hey, God said, let my people go. He performs the signs that God told him to perform, and guess what? Bam, nothing happened. In fact, things got even worse. If you read in Exodus, Pharaoh's like, who is this fool coming in here trying to tell me what to do? So he turns around and makes the Egyptians work the Israelites even harder. So now, not only did what God told Moses, hey, you're going to lead people out, that didn't happen, hasn't happened yet. Not only is that the case, but now his own people, the Israelites, are upset at him. They're like, hey, you don't speak for us. Now they're ready to go after him and run him out of Egypt as well. So while we know ultimately God had a reason for those failures, and he said that, he would give some insight. He's like, I'm going to let this happen so that my power is on full display. The point that I take away from it is so often we think that when we find God's plan for us, from there on, everything's going to just be perfect. And that's just not the case many times. But I take some solace in the fact of knowing that even when you're on God's plan, you can still mess up. Things will still come against you, but that doesn't mean you've missed the mark. I think all too often, lots of people would just quit, say, oh, this is what I thought God called me to do. I tried it. I gave it my best shot. And boom, something came against me. It didn't work. Well, God, I must have missed your mark. And then we just kind of hang it up. So Moses teaches us that even though God told him specifically what to do, and he did exactly what God commanded, he was still slapped with failure after failure. As we keep reading through, we ultimately see that once all the plagues had taken place, Pharaoh finally was like, all right, enough. I'm going to get you out of here. You can do what God said. And as we know, the ending of all that is all of Pharaoh and all his horsemen were killed. And God accomplished what he set out to accomplish. With Moses, it wasn't always easy sailing. It wasn't just because you figured out what you think God's plan is that everybody's going to buy into it. We can continue to read even once, and then this is what's really amazing, is that even when the proof was there that Moses was doing the right thing. So for example, all the children of Israel, they saw the waters come back and kill all the Egyptians and Pharaoh. They knew that was God. But yet if you keep reading, it's just days, weeks, and the timeline's a little shady, but it's not long after, and they're in the desert, and they're turning around again. They're already ready to go back, saying, oh, we have no water. At least we could have died in Egypt. And the point that I'm trying to make is, as far as Moses, from his perspective, surely he had to be thinking, what's going on here? I'm doing exactly what you tell me to, and it's just one hurdle after another after another. A lot of us like to think that this fairy tale ending, like as soon as we just kind of look around through the haze, and once we find God's plan, then everything's perfect from then on out. And Moses, the life of Moses, the book of Exodus teaches us that's not the case. So if I'm going to spin that and try to put a ribbon around both of those 2 points, okay? So the first one is, don't think you've done anything where God can't still use you, okay? Should we always strive to be a better version of ourselves? Absolutely. But we've not done anything that can separate us from the love of God. You might look back and say, man, I've been a scoundrel. I've made some really bad decisions, and I'll just be glad, if God just lets me get into heaven. But that's not the case. He can use anybody, no matter where you are and what you've done. And then secondly is, even when you're moving in the right direction, right? And I believe we should constantly pray, seek God's will, make sure we're going in the right direction. But even when we are doing those things we were destined to do, it doesn't mean it's going to come without opposition. Okay, so you've got to be resilient, you've got to be determined, and you've got to say, no matter what happens, I know I'm doing what God's called me to do. And that can apply to a number of things. It could apply to your education, your career. It could apply to whatever type of biblical work you might be doing. If you're working in a church, it applies to a number of things. And it doesn't just have to be like, a lot of times we think God's only interested in the scriptural things, like only if I'm doing this at church. God cares about the entire person. So if you're pursuing a specific degree, if you are a career path you're going after and things are just stacking up, that's not always an indication that that's not God's will for you. Sometimes God puts challenges in front of us so that we can learn to overcome and be a better version of ourselves. And as we all know, Moses, while there's many hurdles, and I would recommend everybody read it. Not only is it the book of Exodus, not only is it a great depiction of how the history and the genealogy and how the children of Israel got to Egypt and ended up where they would end up being the land of milk and honey. It's a really good point at seeing. It does a good job of explaining Moses, the ups and the downs that he went through. As far as I know, he was the first person, and maybe the only person, but I know the first person that the Bible records that ever got to lay eyes on God and His glory. In fact, it was so bright that he had to put a veil on. People couldn't see him, to talk to him for weeks after, or it may have even been forever. I don't know that they said how long. And there's times it said he spoke to Jesus or spoke with God as one would a friend. So it's an interesting read. I would go and read Exodus. It's a very fast-paced book. If you're not familiar with it, certainly have at it. And really pay attention to what Moses accomplished. Because again, lots of people know the name Moses, but they don't. We tend to Hollywood or glamorize these people, and we want to make them out to be these superheroes in movies who overcome adversity and nothing ever. Once they figured out where they were going, that was the end of it. And well, that was far from the case with Moses. In fact, just go and read it. It's very interesting. But remember, it doesn't matter what you've done, God can still absolutely use you. And then number 2, don't give up. When you sought God's face and you know that you're doing what He's called you to do, don't just give up, because even people close to you may turn against you or turn their back, or naysayers and say, hey, you're not doing the right thing. Seek God's face, do what He's called you to do, and just don't give up on it. Hope you guys enjoy that.